Thanks, Stephanie, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this edition of Building Conversations. We have a great guest, an exciting guest, Peter Moonen from the National Sustainability. He's the National Sustainability Manager for the Canadian Wood Council. So look forward to introducing him later, and then a little bit after that, having some more conversations with him. I hope that you and your loved ones are safe during the times of this pandemic. And without further ado, I will turn my camera off and we'll get today's show underway. Thanks for attending. I will just say that June is a themed month for us at Passivhaus Canada. It is Embodied Carbon Month in Building Conversations. So we'll be having a number of guests this month who focus on embodied carbon or touch on embodied carbon in their presentation. We know that as high performance buildings become the norm, it will drive operational carbon or operating carbon out of the equation, which leaves the question of embodied carbon behind. And this is something that we at Passivhaus Canada are quite concerned about. Embodied carbon isn't yet part of the Passivhaus Institute standards or building standards, but we at Passivhaus Canada are very interested in helping our members and the public understand embodied carbon and understand how we can design and build to reduce embodied carbon. So more about that today and in the weeks ahead. I'm Chris Ballard. I'm the CEO, relatively new CEO here at Passivhaus Canada. I guess I'm into my 7th month now. A little bit about my background. I'm a former Ontario Minister of Environment and Climate Change, a former Ontario Minister of Housing, municipal councillor. I've been a business owner for about 30 years. I'm a former director of a consumer advocacy organization and started my career as a journalist, as a print journalist, many, many years ago. I will say that everything I've learned from my times as a journalist to today has convinced me that passive house design for new and retrofit buildings answers many of our environmental challenges. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so pleased to be promoting passive house design right across our great country. So a little bit about Passivhaus Canada. Who are we? Well, we're a membership-based, not-for-profit organization. We're heavily involved in advocacy, advocating for passive house standards. We do a lot of education and capacity building. We run events. We provide member and technical services. We have about 15 staff in 3 cities across Canada, and we have at least 15 instructors who do these days do mainly online teaching. So I'm going to welcome Peter Moonen now, and you know, Peter will notice, of course, that we have 2 examples of Canadian buildings that utilize wood. Peter is the National Sustainability Manager for the Canadian Wood Council. He works to assist designers and builders understand how to use wood to enhance environmental performance and reduce the ecological footprint of buildings. And that's why we're excited to have him on the show today to help us talk about that ecological footprint. Peter's a Canadian representative at the UN, where he focuses on wood and the green economy. And in addition to a degree in marine biology and zoology, he studied forestry at University of British Columbia, journalism and public affairs in Alberta. So in a few minutes, I'll be inviting Peter to turn on his camera and we'll begin a conversation. But first, I wanted to, as I do every week, drive home this point about Passivhaus and Passivhaus Canada. I continue to have people approach me and say that, well, that passive house standard, that's you know, European standard. It's just meant to sell European doors and windows and components into the Canadian market. And I like to say that that's not really true. Passive house design standards have their roots, in fact, in Canada. Back in 1977, during the first OPEC oil embargo, the government of Saskatchewan grew concerned about how it would help people heat their homes in the cold winters, commissioned a chap by the name of Dr. Orr together with a number of his associates. Dr. Orr, I believe, is a physicist. And they developed the concepts, borrowed from others around the world, but they developed their own concepts. And here is the Saskatchewan Conservation House. It's in Regina, and it has been acknowledged by Passivhaus Institute as an ancestor of today's modern passive house standards. So those of us in Canada involved in the passive house world can take great pride in knowing that those standards, those passive house standards, have a lot of their roots right here in Canada. So I'm asked about the 5 principles of passive house design, and I'm going to assume that most of us on the call today know what those principles are, but I want to run through them for the few who may not be too aware of what they are. The first principle is super insulation. So we have to make sure that the building's envelope is really well insulated. The second thing we have to worry about is that there is airtight construction, no air leaks throughout that envelope. The third thing we're concerned about, thermal bridge free, that there is no easy way for the cold on the outside to get inside or the heat on the inside to get on into the inside. Thermal bridge free. The fourth is very high quality windows with solar orientation. We need our windows that positioned in such a way that in the winter time, in the cold seasons, they let the warmth of the sun in, and in the summer, the hot seasons, they keep the heat of the sun out. And the fifth and final principle that we build our passive house standards on is ventilation system with heat recovery. So important to provide fresh, clean air into our passive house buildings. And I think I've talked a little bit already about who Passivhaus Canada is. I've slipped that slide in twice just to demonstrate how important it is. But you can see these gatherings of passive house folks. These are real passive house folks. They aren't stock photographs. They're all busy doing. And I will say that that's one thing I've learned in my short time at Passivhaus Canada, that passive house people are doers. They are people who roll up their sleeves. They design buildings. They swing the hammers and use the saws. They build the passive house buildings. They aren't just people creating policy out of thin air. They're actually people who create things. And it's really exciting to be part of this organization. Moving along, this is where Peter and I can turn our cameras on and we can begin our conversation. I just have to find my camera button, Peter. And there it is. Welcome, Peter. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks. It's cool, but going to clear off today here on the west coast of Canada.
On Canada, that's good. Well, I'm north of Toronto, and we're trying to figure out what Mother Nature has in store. We're going from 6 degrees on the weekend to hot and sweaty out there today, so we're swinging back and forth. So thanks for joining me today, and for taking some time to talk to us about your organization and the things that you're doing. And as we noted, this is Embodied Carbon Month here in Building Conversations, so we want to touch on that a little bit as well. So Peter, why don't you kick things off by telling us a little bit about the Canadian Wood Council?
Well, the Canadian Wood Council has been around for about 60 years. It's largely a technical support organization that's involved in codes and standards and technical support for architects and engineers, building officials, fire officials, to really help them understand how wood can and should be used and how it should not be used. So it's really there to advocate for the appropriate use of wood materials in construction. And as we know, the capabilities for that have changed a lot over the last 10 years even.
Right. And where is wood at? Can you tell me, I mean, what's the importance to the Canadian economy with the type of wood, the mass timber development? Tell me a little bit about how important this is to the Canadian economy.
Well, the mass and heavy timber sector, that's glulam and CLT and nail laminated timber and Dow laminated timber and all the other massive products, are a continuation of a value chain. It starts in the forest. We've got lots of companies that produce lumber. Our largest market is the United States for the housing industry. But
Okay.
about 20 years ago, there was a recognition that maybe wood can do more.
Hmm.
So the organization established the Woodworks program. It's a
Okay.
national program to help architects and engineers get a better understanding of what's possible. And what sort of we sort of did something to ourselves unintentionally. It started off as a booster. We'd show lovely pictures of wood buildings and say, "Hey, isn't this great?" And we'd have architects and engineers go, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, okay. How do we do it?" Uh, so so we ended up we brought on a bunch of engineering people who had a lot of experience in heavy and mass timber, and over time we've really developed a very strong wood culture in British Columbia and
Mhm.
Ontario. It's growing in the Maritimes, Alberta, and Quebec. Quebec has a Sécobois program, which is similar to Woodworks. It's really grown, and as we've seen, we have tall wood buildings, we have light wood frame buildings going up to 6 stories. We have bigger buildings, more products. It's really, it's sort of at a pivotal point for the forest sector because we recognized we can do more with wood than just turn it into 2x4 plywood and
Right.
paper.
Right.
So
And
it's a
turn it
fun time to
into
be in the
those 2x4s that we use for our typical stick building homes.
sector.
Then we
Yep,
promptly cover it up with another type of facade and hide it there. And I know here at Passivhaus Canada, we've run into the same sort of issue where we talk about passive houses and how beautiful they are, etc., how practical, how affordable, and we have people say that's great, but how do we do it?
yeah.
So, like you guys, we've had to do a lot of education and a lot of outreach, and we're still doing it in response. It's not just good enough to talk about it; you actually have to help people go out and do it.
Well,
So,
I find that the more I learn about this stuff, the less I realize I know.
yeah,
I don't know whether that's a Benjamin Button syndrome that I'm going through or not, but there is so much going on in building environment, building science. It's hard to keep up, but it's also really inspiring.
yeah. So, there's been some interesting developments. I'm certainly aware of what's happening in Ontario. It's only been a few years since Ontario permitted um, wood buildings, above a couple of stories. What's happening here? What's happening and what's happening across the country? And I understand maybe it's not recent. I understand that Vancouver, for example, is allowing even higher wood structures.
Well, the National Building Code 2020
Yeah.
is going to have a component which allows heavy and mass timber, encapsulated mass timber structures up to 12 stories. So
Right.
as provinces accept that building code, those provinces will be able to have those kinds of buildings. British Columbia adopted that a bit early. There's 13 local governments around the province who have demonstrated their capacity to evaluate and assess these buildings. Alberta has accepted it. Quebec already has a building that's 14 stories. In Toronto, there's several projects that are being undertaken of heavy and mass timber. So, and the thing that I really like about the wood sector is that there is a real strong collaboration between engineers and architects because they want to see this happen. They realize the benefits, whether it's energy performance, whether it's speed of construction, whether it's aesthetics, or whether it's energy and embodied carbon. They recognize that there is a place for wood. It's not the only material. As I was saying to you the other day, there's only one building in Canada I know of that's a single material, and that's an igloo. All the rest are a composition of wood and steel and concrete and glass, aluminum, copper, you name it. So we have to sort of understand that.
Right, right. And I know at Passive House, we say we're agnostic when it comes to what materials you use. What we're really trying to focus on is the building performance, the measurement at the end to make sure you met Passive House standards. So we're not really concerned. Our standards really don't care whether or not you use a high carbon or low carbon, but more and more of our members are telling us we need to focus on low carbon, lower embodied carbon. So can you talk to us for a few minutes about why wood is a good choice for that? This
Well,
being embodied carbon month and all.
okay. Well, from a carbon perspective, there's several areas where wood can play a role. Um, it's first of all, it's renewable. So as you remove, you know, forests or wood from a forest and you regenerate that, you're recapturing carbon in the new forest, and hopefully you're using the wood that you've got that you've taken out in a long-lived building. And I should point out that we have a problem with tearing down buildings that are perfectly functional, regardless of whether they're wood,
Yeah.
steel, or concrete. And we have to make buildings that are endearing and enduring, and that can change to our needs. So that's a human decision that we make.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as architects and engineers make better buildings, those buildings will be able to last longer because we won't be changing our minds about them. So from a carbon point of view, the forest is a carbon sink. When you use wood, you are actually sequestering carbon. It's basically you're delaying the emission of that carbon back into the atmosphere,
Right.
and all materials eventually go back to the atmosphere, all renewable materials. And then there's also a role to play for substituting where you can with materials that might have a higher impact to do the same job.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the sink, sequester, substitute aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And those are becoming, people are becoming more aware. And you know, I think the buildings that we're going to see down the road are going to be hybrid buildings. They're going to use wood where it's appropriate, steel and concrete, to sort of merge those three materials to make better performing and longer lasting buildings.
And longer lasting buildings. So tell me, you talked about this emergence roughly 20 years ago, the reemergence of wood into the built environment. What forms does this new type of wood take? We hear, you know, you've used some technical terms. We're talking about mass timber, we're talking about laminate, and yet some of the simpler buildings, passive house buildings I see, the more complex ones are using mass timber. Some of the simpler ones, it's simple, you know, plank, board and batten, that kind of thing, but it's still beautiful wood. So what forms of wood are new? Some of the engineered woods.
Well, okay, you mentioned, I think the key word there is engineered. And an engineered wood is one that uses a resin or a glue to bind small pieces into larger pieces. That actually enhances the utilization of the wood. So, you know, 10 2x6s can make a beam that you might not be able to get a solid piece of wood for, and it would be stronger. So the engineered wood products, there's many that use veneer. There's some that use long flakes or strips. You've probably seen oriented strand board or laminated veneer lumber, plywood. But recently there have been the solid wood engineered wood products like cross laminated timber, dowel laminated timber, and nail laminated timber. And nail laminated timber, if there's anybody who's on from Vancouver, if you've gone down to Gastown Steamworks Landing building and go to the basement, you can see nail laminated timber in the roof from a building that was built over 100 years ago. So sometimes what's old is new, and what's new is old. But we're just using the better technology of engineering and technology of resins to make products that can be used in place of other materials. So,
Right.
and I think the darling child right now is cross-laminated timber. It's one of a family, and it has a number of uses that are really proving to be beneficial to labor trades because we're losing trades, to developers, and to the occupants because it's often exposed, or a percentage of it is exposed.
Yeah. So what is that particular product? Tell me a little bit more about that particular product. I probably could recognize it, but tell me about it.
You know, I thought about getting a sample out of my basement, but if you have a piece of wood,
Uh-huh.
and this is the end grain like this, and you add another one like this, and then another one like that, so these are 2x6s,
Right.
and you build it up, you can build up a layer. So you'd have a 3 or a 5 or a 7 or a 9 ply board that looks like a massive timber with some boards this way and some boards that way. So they're
Okay.
cross and laminated. So the cross is the orientation and the lamination is the glue. They're made in large presses. They are then machined for window openings, door openings, connections, and they can be machined on large CNCs to a fraction of a millimeter. So the accuracy is really a key part of that. That makes easy assembly, and as you mentioned in your slide, airtightness.
And that
So,
airtightness.
so it makes for a very good building envelope, and it allows rapid construction, and it's actually playing a role in reducing the labor demands for a building as well. In the Brock Commons building, 18 stories out at UBC, there were 9 crew members as they built the entire structure after the concrete base,
Mm-hmm.
and they completed that building in 9.5 weeks. Had it been
Wow.
a concrete or steel building, you would have had about 50 to 54 people on the site.
Yeah.
So
I attended the carpenters training hall here in Vaughan,
yeah,
Ontario.
yeah,
And they have a course there,
yes,
mass timber, and they were talking about exactly what you're saying about how much faster buildings can be erected, and how it really cuts down on clogging the streets with construction vehicles,
yeah,
all day long. And I
yes,
know if I were an elected official in any of the major cities across Canada, especially Toronto, that seems to have multiple construction projects shutting down all sorts of streets all the time, I would be really interested, if for no other reason
yeah.
than it would mean the streets would not have to be closed as often. I'd be really interested in promoting this kind of thing. So these laminated beams that you're talking about, they can be used in place of a steel I-beam, and
Yeah.
imagine, because they're wood, you can leave them exposed because they're pretty.
Yes. So those are the glue laminated timber. Those are classified as heavy timber.
Yeah.
The mass timber are usually flat and they're panels.
Okay.
And the heavy timber are basically built up pieces. They're laminated as well, but they're
Mhm.
all oriented in the same way
Okay.
to provide load support. And then the beams are, these are the boards. Those are acting as the span. Um, so they are beautiful. They can be exposed. You have to treat them differently. It's not just substituting steel with wood. We're still on, Chris?
Turn our,
Oh, there you go.
we'll turn our, there we go. Yeah, I just needed to turn my video off for a second and refresh things. Sorry.
Okay,
So you're
no
talking
worries.
about the orientation of the mass panel to support.
Yeah, it's a load-bearing structural element. So one of the things that we're encountering is that it's not a simple substitution.
Right.
Substituting wood for steel or steel for concrete or concrete for wood or wood for concrete. You can't just sort of say, oh, we'll just plug this in and take that out.
Right.
There's a different engineering function, a different aesthetic function. I like to say that as an architect or an engineer, you should learn about the 4 basic structural components: wood, steel, concrete, stone, and masonry. Just like a chef learns about meat, dairy, grains, fruit, and vegetables. And if you don't understand one of those materials, it's sort of like being a chef doesn't understand vegetables. So it doesn't mean you have to be a vegetarian. It means you have to understand how to make a great meal using those materials.
Right.
Um, and but you treat each one differently, and
Right.
that's where the Woodworks program is trying to build up the skills of future practitioners, so they have an understanding and they can include that material in their repertoire of expertise.
Excellent. You know, and I don't think any discussion with someone from your organization wouldn't be complete if you didn't talk to us for a minute or two about just the aesthetics of wood and how wood is really being rediscovered um, in our environment. And what are the benefits of exposed wood where we can see some beautiful wood?
Well, I'll bet you that most of the people who are on this webinar have an understanding of the principles of biophilia. Um, we are, you know, organic organisms, and there is a natural affinity for that which is from outside, whether it's trees or rock or stone or water or clouds. Those are things which reduce our stress level. And there's medical evidence about this, and I know that, you know, that's an area of your interest. There are some stress reduction benefits. Increasingly, we're seeing benefits of both green buildings and natural exposed materials in care homes, hospitals, mental health facilities, schools.
Right.
And by reducing stress, you can increase the recovery potential, the education learning potential, the productivity potential for, you know, people in an office. So, you know, these are other things that I think down the road we're going to be concerned with. How can this building actually make our lives better?
Right.
And I know that you've had this discussion and met Ty Farrell. This is the kind of thing that a building should do more than just not do bad things. It can
Mhm.
actually do good things.
Right.
And how do we incorporate that into it?
And Ty, for those who don't know, do a little Google research on Ty Farrow, Farrow, and you know, another I want to say hidden Canadian gem, known internationally, acclaimed internationally, and I don't think we do enough in our country to acknowledge who he is and what he's talking about. But certainly that intersect between, you know, the built form and our environment in which we live and work, and its effect on our mental and physical health can't be understated. You were telling me an example about a hospital that does orthopedic surgery.
Yeah, and several years ago, a fellow from the BC Building Corporation was talking about an orthopedic hospital that expanded, and the new wing was a green design, and it looked out onto a green belt. After you know, and then patients would go in, and they would either go to this bed or that bed, depending on what was empty. After operating for a while, they realized that the patients that were in the green building wing, that looking over a park, had a 20%, 21% shorter stay on average than those who were in the original block. Well, I don't know how many healthcare facilities might be interested in a 21% reduction in healthcare costs, but I think almost everyone would. That's not to say that you know, that it was solely due to any one factor. But as we understand more about ourselves, how we respond to our environment, is it light, is it heat, is it moisture, is it particulate, is it aesthetics, is it temperature, you know, all that kind of stuff, then we'll be better able to design buildings that enhance us. And I think wood plays a strong role in that.
Right. Yeah, it absolutely does. I'm just thinking to myself that here at Passivhaus Canada, we may one day have to change our name to Activehouse Canada because of the active nature of this built form in terms of our mental and physical health. But that'll just
Yeah.
confuse everyone. For now, we are Passivhaus Canada. So what I like how you framed the idea of using today's wood products akin to a chef knowing all of the ingredients that go into a house and making sure they have the right mix. So I know I'm told, I know with a passive house building, good passive houses always begin with good design, and I would imagine it's similar if you're building with a lot of wood products, that
Yeah.
you can't just substitute after the architect designs a building. Someone else just can't say, no, we're going to swap that piece of steel out and put a piece of wood in.
Yeah.
It's really, you have to
Yeah.
think from the get-go how you're going to build
Yeah.
and incorporate
Yeah.
wood in. Yeah.
Well,
What other exciting programs do you have for us? Sorry we've got a bit of video lag. What were you going to say?
I was just saying that, you know, buildings are collection of systems to be one system, and understanding how those interact makes a difference. As passive house people know, window size changes mechanical size. And you know, mechanical size changes electricity. So when we design with heavy and mass timber, we're changing how we put the building together. People often ask us, well, how much does the CLT building cost? My response is, how much is a car? What do you want it to do?
Right.
So it's not a simple replacement, but there are savings and there are going to be costs. And part of what our job is try to build up the experience so that the designers understand the implications of making a change from this type of column to that column, this panel to that panel, this window to that panel, this window.
Yeah, I like that analogy with regards to automobiles. We get asked the same thing about the cost of a passive house, and I think I'm going to steal that analogy from now on. You know,
it's yours.
A passive house that is the Camry, version, rock solid. It's going to last you forever. It's a great piece of transportation. Or if you want the Bugatti, people will do that for you as well, and it's going to cost a little more. So good analogy. What other programs are you involved with, Peter, that you'd like to share with our viewers today?
Well, my role is national, so I am there to support the Woodworks programs in the Maritimes, Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. But the Canadian Wood Council is also involved in developing a very comprehensive education program for colleges and universities. It's called Wood Smart. We've engaged dozens and dozens of engineering and architecture and trades professional educators from across the country to get their input so that we develop something that fits with what they need to do. One of the big areas that I think will be in the future is, how do we train our trades? An architect and an engineer can design a building, but if no one knows how to put it together, we got a problem. And this is where, you know, I know that Passive House has the course where they say, okay, you're going to be an architect and design passive houses. Let's see how well you build it. Yeah. So I think that hands-on experience is really important. And that's why we've done stuff with the Carpenters Union in Ontario. We've done work with the trade schools here in British Columbia, Camosun College and BCIT. So we have to teach them about the materials. We also have to teach them about the outcomes. And increasingly, those are about energy performance, passive house, air tightness. The thing that I really I like, I was in the very first mid-rise passive house in Vancouver called The Heights by Scott Kennedy at Cornerstone. And I'm walking around with a developer, and the developers looked around and said, gosh, I wish our construction sites looked like this. And I said, that's the culture of excellence, that if you have a team that understands what the outcome is, that culture of excellence permeates everything, even to the fact that the floors are swept because dust affects the taping. So that kind of thing is, as more and more people become competent at passive house or with wood, they'll become better at it, and they'll become more familiar, and they'll become advocates for it. I don't know too many passive house architects who say, you know what, I'm going to go back to build conventional code. Right. It affects how they do work.
Right, and that goes for our professionals. It goes for our trades. I'm always impressed sitting in on a trades program and talking to carpenters, to framers, to folks who are there because they know that there's a better way of building, and they want to be the best tradesperson they can possibly be. And once they get a taste of passive house design, passive house principles, and they really understand how simple the concept is, there's never any going back to them. They can't go back and work for you know, a guy who's throwing a stick frame house up, barely meeting code. They're just not going to do it. And as you say, the same with architects. I've never met an architect, a passive house certified architect, who said, nah, I'm going to go back and build to the minimum, which is what code is. So it's really exciting to see the quality of people
Yes.
this movement attracts.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that I think there's a really nice alignment between wood and passive house. Increasingly, as our building become regulated to have higher energy performance, that makes the walls more complex.
Right.
That means that sometimes it's more difficult to build it on site than it is off site. But to build off site, you know, when my house was being built, something wasn't right. They just got a 10-pound sledge and they knocked it. You don't want to do that with a building envelope that's 14 inches thick. So I think the notion of the imperative of prefabrication is a really good fit with wood and mass timber and passive house from an accuracy point of view, and tightness, wall complexity, wall performance, and that shortage of labor trades. If you can consolidate your labor and incorporate so much in a controlled environment and deliver on site, you're also getting speed. And as you mentioned, not wanting to disrupt the cities, as we reinvigorate our downtown areas, there's no empty parking lots for staging trailers and equipment and personnel and vehicles.
No.
We're going to have a truck pull up, have the part lifted off and installed. And I was on Monday at a passive house project in North Vancouver, right at the foot of Lonsdale. It's a restaurant and an office building, all mass timber. So we went 2 miles away to the staging area where they've got mass timber panels, glulam. They were fitting all the connections. All the insulation was installed. All the exterior cladding was installed. And the whole building will go up in about 2 weeks.
Wow.
Starting in mid-July through into August. So that the aspect of prefabricating off-site delivers so many benefits, and wood is a material that lends itself to that prefabrication and rapid construction.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, I think we've run out of time for our conversation, but maybe I'll ask Stephanie. Do we have questions, Stephanie?
It doesn't look like we have any questions at this point. So Peter, perhaps you've answered everybody's questions throughout your presentation.
I was going to say it's pretty thorough. The one question I always like to ask is where are we going with wood next? What's on the horizon for this product?
You know, that's a great question. 15 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to predict cross-laminated timber. The first I ever heard of it was when I saw a presentation by Andrew Waugh in 2008. I'd never heard of cross-laminated timber before. There are a couple of products which I think are quite interesting. One is wood fiber insulation. And as you know, some of the insulations, they do a great job, but they have a pretty high embodied impact. And so when you're talking from an embodied carbon month, comparing the embodied impact of a fiberglass or a mineral wool or a polyurethane or a spray foam or a wood fiber is something which can make a big difference into the overall impact. Chris Magwood from Peterborough in Ontario has done a lot of work on really high performing buildings and has evaluated, well, gee, what's the impact of how I'm building? He uses a lot of straw. He uses wood frame. And he has presented on the embodied impacts, and insulation is a huge factor. So we've been working on a project to try and demonstrate the efficiency of wood fiber insulation, and that's been done through FP Innovations. Now we're trying to say, how do we develop a business plan so that it can be made here rather than in Europe? And it's one of those vicious circles of well, wow, wood insulation is a great product. How come it's so expensive? Because it comes from Europe. How come it comes from Europe? Because nobody makes it here. Why does nobody make it here? Because there's no market. Why is there no market? Because it's expensive. So we have to break that cycle. And I think, you know, with the willingness of people to look at new structural products, maybe we'll find a forest company that says, hey, you know what, here's a great product that we can use. It fits in with where designers want to go with their buildings.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know, high performance, low carbon.
Right.
But you know, that's going to take time.
That's going to Peter, I do have a question for you.
Certainly.
Do you spend a considerable amount, how much time do you spend dealing with cement associations in regards to their red flags surrounding fire?
You know, the thing about, I mean, my mom used to say, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. But I get along well with several people in the concrete industry. I understand that they have a market that they want to protect. As I was telling one fellow who used to work out here in the cement sector, every new mass timber or mid-rise light frame building is a new market for concrete, because if they likely wouldn't have been built in steel and concrete. So I think I don't like it when people try to change people's minds through fear. We have enough of that these days in other areas. It's not appropriate to point it to some of the new construction, because every building code requires that all materials meet the same fire standards, period. Mm-hmm. Wood is more susceptible during the construction phase, granted, and that's why there are steps and requirements for wood that are not for other materials during that phase. But make no mistake, the fire code is performance-based and requires that you demonstrate that you've met their requirements regardless of your material.
That's a great answer.
I think that, again, I talked earlier about the merging of materials. Brock Commons, 18 stories, concrete columns for lateral support, and concrete base and wood. That's a good merger of materials. And both wood and concrete are dependent on steel. So, you know, people can spend millions of dollars to hammer at the wood industry, or they could sit down with the wood industry and say, okay, let's move ahead. Let's make buildings that are fast, safe, strong, reliable, efficient, beautiful, and cost effective. Mm-hmm. And rather than tossing money at ad campaigns that show buildings that were built 50 years ago burning up.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say my own research into this when I was the Minister of Housing revolved around asking some friends who were firefighters what they thought about this concept, these new proposals. They absolutely had no problems at all of just as regular firefighters, frontline guys, going and you know, being worried. In fact, a number of them pointed out to me they thought that these buildings would be safer because of the charring and the protection that the wood beams would have. So that's my own non-scientific research. Go talk to some of the people who might be faced with some challenges, and they didn't see it as a challenge at all. They look forward to more of these types of structures in Ontario.
Yeah, so and you know, Chris, we had when the new building code came out in 2009 to allow light frame construction, right. The very first building burned down, which was a real tragedy for the occupants. Who it was parts of it were almost complete, but the owner rebuilt it in wood, and the fire protection for those buildings was evaluated and upped. So that there's now a standpipe that is charged as the building goes up. So following that, the firefighters said, look, what you're doing in wood buildings, we should do in every building. Mm-hmm. So, and then 3 years ago, we did a fire demonstration with CLT where we burned 3 different structures, and we set the same amount of fuel in these structures, a steel and a mass timber structure, and then a composite one. And after the CLT building was out, I was standing there looking at the charring, which was about ½ an inch in after an hour. And a firefighter who didn't know me was looking around going, okay, yep, I'd walk into a burning CLT building, because he understood what was happening. And firefighters don't look at charts and critical failure points and collapse in time. They want to see it, and they're hands-on guys.
Yeah, and so those are the folks I talked to, and whoever has been teaching them obviously knew what they were talking about. So my initial fears were somewhat erased, and it's wonderful to see this made in Canada product being used more and more across our country and around the world. I look forward to, as you say, the major markets are the US, and I look forward as more and more products, components, passive house components manufactured in Canada are exported nationally. But it looks like, Stephanie, unless there's any more questions, I do believe we have run out of time. So, are there any more questions, Stephanie? We good?
Yes, there was one question to ask Peter about what his best guess is for costing per square foot of basic wood products.
Yikes.
Oh, best guess. You know what? I remember I said that the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know very much. The costing is really all over the map, because, as I said, you can have a little two-seater car, or you can have a Rolls Royce. It's really hard. We get that asked a question a lot about CLT, and it's just unfair to the product. I understand why people are asking it, because they don't want to go down a route of exploring it and then finding that it's too expensive or it doesn't perform. I'm happy to, so if someone wants to ask me a specific question on that, I'm happy to take those questions. My email is pmoonen@cwsp.ca. I'm happy to refer you to people who would actually know that. That's not my area.
And if anyone has any of those technical type questions for Peter, you're easily found on your organization's website.
Yes. Yeah.
So reach out and ask Peter if you're interested in passive house questions. Reach out to us, and we'll cross-reference.
Yeah.
Great. Any closing final comments, Peter? Something that I've missed?
No, I think you've covered pretty much everything, Chris. I know that we have a very good working relationship with Passive House, because it's our two sort of technologies meld well together.
Yes.
And I think that as we see bigger buildings like this project in Vancouver, the Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency is moving down towards tall and passive wood buildings. The city wants that. We'll start to see that, you know, there's an increasingly natural fit, and that more people are capable of delivering this. And I think that's what you're striving for, is to have more designers competent and understanding of passive house and how it can be done properly and cost effectively. Same with us with some of the new wood products.
Right.
So I look forward to working this. And as I say, if anyone has questions, if I don't know the answer, chances are I might be able to direct you to someone who does.
You'll know someone who does. Well, listen, Peter, I wish you all the best, and I wish wood all the best in future. It's a very important component of not only passive houses, but many structures across the country. Look forward to having a chat in future and learning more. And I look forward to, once we can leave our home offices, to meeting you on the dusty trail as we educate government decision makers, architects, engineers across the country. So thank you very much for your time. And
my pleasure.
I will invite us both to turn off our cameras, and I'll wrap up today's conversation. And see you soon.
Great.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Chris.
So I will say thank you very much to everyone on today's call. Next week, we have continuing the theme of Embodied Carbon Month here at Building Conversations. We have Anthony Pack, who's an expert in embodied carbon, especially when it comes to buildings and passive house buildings. So I look forward to having a conversation with Anthony right here next Wednesday at noon EDT. And as Peter said, if you have any questions about today's show, feel free to email us, and we'll answer them as best we can. Take care. Have a safe week. We'll see you next week.